Okay. Colleague Danielle, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody who's watching or listening via YouTube. And in this Zoom room conversation today, it's this morning in Washington, D.C., 11:15 or so. My name is Jeff Gedman. I'm with the American Interest. But please read us online and in print, and please join these Zoom conversations that we have now ongoing during lockdown in this spring and summer. David Goodhart is our guest today. David, I think you're interesting and important for a number of reasons. One being you're my friend, but also, David, you're a highly regarded writer, editor, public intellectual. I said to a couple of colleagues before we began just now that I think in the area of immigration, you were on to things before many of us in grasping and articulating that immigration is about a lot more than borders and immigration, and it goes to sovereignty and culture and identity. You were doing this work years ago, and then many of us caught up with you, the importance of this. You wrote a book that was so helpful to many of us in trying to understand my shorthand, the roots of the movement to Brexit and of Trumpism in the United States, but happening across the West and other countries. And you coined an expression in and for the book. You made a distinction between so-called somewheres and so-called anywheres, the latter being, in my shorthand, I'm just probably not doing fair or justice to you, but bear with me. You know, global elites who are broadly agile, entrepreneurial, and have adapted well to the new world, driven by technology and other things, and others who are no less decent, intelligent, or honorable, but are more locally rooted for a variety of reasons and ways and preferences. And so I'm not going to go on about that, but I'm going to mention it. And David, you have a new book coming out in September, and we want to hear about that. We want to hear about, if you would, the parliamentary testimony you gave today. But I think, and I'm borrowing from Erwin Stelzer, who's with us, we can start anywhere you want. But one thing on our minds is, and I'm borrowing, I'm copying Erwin. Do we have a pendulum swing? And across the West and Britain and the United States, do we have a moment and movement now in politics, trade, and economy where the somewheres will be tended to more properly and the anywheres will be brought back home or brought to heel or brought to responsibility or brought to something? So David, that I'm painting a broad picture, but I wanted to get a lot out there. David, thank you. And then on that or anything that's on your mind, let's start, and then we're going to weave people in as we go. David, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thanks, Jeff, for that very flattering introduction. I've really enjoyed reading the magazine. Indeed, you cleverly forced me to subscribe because I wanted to read those interesting essays you reproduced. I think it was from 2015 on race in America, obviously prompted by recent events. And I was hoping to be able to read them all for free, but I couldn't. So I'm now a subscriber. But yes, so you talk about the distinctions I made, the value. I mean, I was trying to understand it was, I mean, a kind of almost sympathetic a sympathetic understanding of the changes and the populist movements of recent times by looking at these value divisions. And I coined these terms: the people that see the world from anywhere and the people that see the world from somewhere. Now, I mean, obviously those are very binary and sort of simplistic in a way. And I obviously had lots of subdivisions within the anywheres, lots of subdivisions in the somewheres. There's a whole middle in-betweener group. But these value groups really do exist. I mean, I invented these labels that helped my book do quite well. They sort of struck a chord. But the value groups really do exist. Certainly, it's mainly the kind of empirical base is the UK, but I think you would find similar things in the similar divisions in the US. I mean, I think it's important. Just one small point, in just to sort of correct or elucidate your description. I mean, the anywheres are not just the highly internationally connected top sort of 3 or 5%. The anywheres form what one might call a mass elite. I mean, essentially the kind of modern graduate class in our societies. So we're talking 25, 30, 35% of the population have, and that's perhaps somewhat higher in the UK because we have overwhelmingly residential universities. So, sorry, are you hearing a funny clicking noise, by the way?
We do. I don't know where that comes from. I do.
I think it may be from me, but I'm not quite sure what to do about it. Can we live with it? Well, I think we may have to. Anyway, I was just the Anywhere group is a much broader one, perhaps, than is often often in the sort of brief descriptions comes across as. It's a very large minority in our societies, which has dominated our politics and our cultures, and of which, you know, the populist somewhere pushback has been a response, I think, to the over-domination of the priorities of Anywheres, which have tended to who have valued mobility and autonomy, and they've tended, even when they're on the left, to be highly individualistic, and they're comfortable with modern fluidity and openness and so on. Now, and actually, but probably one of the best ways of thinking about this, actually, or a sort of supplementary way of thinking about this distinction, comes from the otherwise deadly dull American sociologist Talcott Parsons, who talked about this distinction between achieved and ascribed identities. I mean, Anywheres essentially are people whose sense of themselves comes from their own achievements, from, you know, passing exams when you're young and going to good universities, or more or less good universities, and having more or less successful professional careers. And therefore, one's sense of oneself comes from sort of from inside, from one's own achievements, and therefore it means that one can kind of move around the map comfortably, because you sort of your sense of yourself is sort of portable. Whereas for still, you know, quite for probably a majority of people, even in rich societies, their identity comes from their ascribed characteristics. I mean, basically meaning their connection to place and group, and it means that your identity is therefore much more susceptible to being disturbed by social change, particularly rapid social change, which means that the place that you connect your identity to, the group you connect your identity to, change, and that therefore affects you in a way that Anywheres, I think, often fail to understand. Anyway, so that's just by way of sort of preface. So, how does the COVID crisis sort of impact on this, my story of the value divisions, and how we indeed try and, you know, the goal of politics is to overcome these divisions, or to mitigate and minimize them, so that we can all live happily together to some extent. And does the COVID crisis help in that or not? I think in some ways it does, although I think the American and the European stories probably diverge somewhat here. I mean, I would say that the result of the crisis in the UK, and indeed much of the rest of Europe, will be to promote a kind of, well, two forms of politics. I think two political impulses are going to benefit from what is happening. One is a conservative one. I mean, probably both small c and big C. I mean, in the sense that this has been very much a crisis. It's been the hour of the nation state. It's been the hour of national social contracts. You know, we've closed our economies and then underwritten people's support through furlough schemes and short-time working and increased welfare payments and all sorts of things here, somewhat less so in the US, although to some extent in the US as well. So it's been very much the hour of the nation state and national social contracts. It has obviously, I mean, you know, we have yet to kind of discover quite how things will change, but it has made us somewhat more suspicious of what Danny Roderick calls hyperglobalization. I mean, one of the wittiest slogans to come out of the crisis, coined by Morris Glassman, Lord Morris Glassman, the founder of the so-called Blue Labour movement here in the UK. He came up with this rather witty slogan: "Workers of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your supply chains." You know, well, we were already seeing the kind of rearrangement of the US-China supply chain even before the crisis. This has not been a crisis in which the kind of motifs of hyperliberalism have come out well. So this has been a small c conservative crisis. It's reinforced the nation state. It's made us more suspicious of those of hyperconnectivity. It's reinforced the local. It's reinforced the family too, to some extent. I mean, not always necessarily with happy consequences, but people have been kind of forced to sort of think about, you know, who they value most, and have been, you know, the sort of professional identities come overwhelmingly from work, but most people, particularly the people I think of as the somewheres, their most powerful identifications are not with professional accomplishment, but with family. And so I think in all those respects, this is this is a crisis for small c conservatism. On the other hand, it's combined with again here, and I think probably to some extent in the US. I mean, partly because the state has proved somewhat, because the state in the central state is weaker in the US. So I don't think this applies quite so much. Indeed, in some ways, it's been a crisis of authority and a crisis of the central state in the US, whereas it's been a reinforcement of the nation state in most of Europe. But alongside that, this has also been a crisis in which what one might call the public care economy has been at the centre, and the public care economy is run by the professional public sector elites who overwhelmingly tend toward the kind of social democratic left. Their interests are mainly in higher public spending and so on. They certainly in Europe, somewhat lesser extent in the US, I mean, they're a very, very dominant cultural force. You might even say the dominant cultural force, even when conservatives are in power. The sort of social democratic ethos of the public sector professional, you know, that has completely dominates parties of the left and to some extent even parties of the centre right. So it's sort of been their hour too. I mean, it's the kind of the hour of kind of public sector, what Matt Crawford calls safetyism. You know, risk averse safetyism has been one of the kind of motifs. You know, it has tended to be people on the right who have been sort of saying, "Come on, let's get rid of all this bloody lockdown stuff and get going again." It's been people on the left who've generally been saying, "No, you know, we must all sort of, you know, stay locked down." And so I mean, I think what I am exemplifying is what one might call COVID confirmation bias, given that I mean, you know, one reads into the crisis essentially what one saw as the trends even before the crisis, and I've certainly been arguing that the sort of general direction of British politics and to some extent of European politics more generally is a movement that has been moving somewhat to the right culturally and somewhat to the left economically. And you might even say that the Boris Johnson government sort of embodies that to some extent, even though perhaps not Boris Johnson himself, who's a very sort of flamboyantly liberal character in many ways. But certainly, as it were, the kind of Dominic Cummings, his principal advisor, who is not a big C conservative, and I think does embody, and indeed the kind of more sensible wing of the Brexit movement embodied that kind of combination of somewhat to the right culturally, but somewhat to the left. It's rather the sort of Daniel Bell political ethos, actually. I remember being rather impressed and sort of almost adopting it myself a few years ago when I came across this famous interview some journalist did with Bell a few years ago before he died. Actually, no, I think it was way back in the 1980s, actually. And he was asked for his political credo, and he said, in economics, I'm a social democrat. In politics, I'm a liberal, and in cultural and social matters, I'm somewhat conservative. I can't remember his exact words, but it's something along those lines. And I think this has been the kind of missing middle of politics in rich countries for the last 30 or 40 years, to which I think that sort of the kind of better wing of the populist movements have also been sort of reaching towards. And I think the crisis might well reinforce that sort of double, that sort of conservative, sort of reinforcing conservatism and kind of moderate nationalism combined with a kind of moderate collectivism, higher public spending. We're going to need to beef up our health systems, make sure that they're more resilient in the future, etc., etc. So yeah, I mean, I guess that would be my sort of overview political thought about COVID. I mean, I haven't been following the crisis obviously as closely in the US, and I think what I'm saying doesn't necessarily apply so much, partly because the crisis has sort of has revealed your own deep polarizations. You've had huge differences between different states. You've had the central state doesn't have a huge amount of authority, or Trump doesn't seem to have used it very much. And you've had the kind of the culture wars have not paused. Indeed, if anything, they seem to have been exacerbated, which has been less true here. Although that did return, that has re-emerged to some extent in the UK. We had this crisis over the guy I just mentioned, Dominic Cummings, who Boris Johnson's main advisor and the presiding genius behind the Brexit campaign, and indeed Johnson's victory in the 2019 December 29 election. Well, people disagree about what happened, but he broke the rules. Well, did he break the rules? I mean, you're in certain extreme circumstances, you are allowed to break the lockdown rules. So some people would say that his circumstances were extreme. His wife had the illness. He feared his son would get it, and he drove 250 miles to the north of England, where his parents and nieces were, to get help. And this was discovered, and it became a huge issue. And it would kind of revive the old Brexit divides, and particularly the very pro-Remainer sections of the political class and the media really wanted his head, and they didn't get it. It probably did damage the government to some extent, but it brought back all those divisions, which hitherto had been. The government in the UK has done a kind of okay job, and we've had very high levels of death, as you know, comparable to yours. I mean, probably in both cases to do with it's something to do with the relative, the very unhealthy societies that we both are. Incredibly high levels of obesity in the US and the UK. I suspect that we probably have the highest per capita levels of obesity of any country in Europe. Inequality probably has something to do with that. I mean, we both of us are more unequal than mainstream sort of Christian democratic European countries. And we unlike, say, Germany, we didn't. We're a short-termist kind of society. We didn't have the inbuilt resilience because we live much more hand to mouth. We're much more consumer oriented and less investment oriented. Again, probably rather like the US, both of us being more sort of free market societies. So we were less well prepared, and we also have these great global cities that seeded the infection, New York and London. So I mean, a lot of the enemies of the respective governments in the US and the UK are putting it all down to government incompetence, and I don't think, certainly our government hasn't covered itself in glory, but it hasn't been a disaster either. I think when we come to look at the properly analyse the crisis and try and understand why some countries did so much better or worse than others, I think that the role of government is likely to be there's a bird has escaped. Oh, it's gone. I think
David, that was my sound that we're going to move to discussion in a moment.
The
okay,
birds are
all
right.
Set up, and Danielle muted me, but she can't mute my birds. David, thank you. I don't mean to be rude, and I do want to be.
No, absolutely, no. I'm fine.
No. That was a splendid start, and a lot of territory covered and well covered, and we have a lot of people who want to get into the conversation with you. I'm gonna nevertheless indulge myself with one question first, and then I'm going to go to Ron Dvorkin, and then we'll work in others. David, you alluded to one thing. In this world of policy and politics, there are the things we can and the things we cannot control. And you alluded to technology-driven social change, or mostly technology-driven social change, which has been rapid and deep in recent years. How do you think about that? Because I think there's certain things that we've been nailing, thanks to you. Certain things we're beginning to correct, thanks to you and other good colleagues who work in this space. But there are other things that speed ahead, that whether this or that category of anywhere or somewhere are kind of out of the bottle, so to speak, having to do with communication and technology. I'll tell you, I've got a friend in the Czech Republic. He's a philanthropist. He thinks he's nailed things, and he tells me, we've got it now. We've got disenchantment of voters and a lack of accountability and excess corruption, and we have the technology. We need direct democracy on everything from trash collection to troop deployments. He's got it now. That's his nailing of it. I don't think that's it. I think that's incomplete and problematic in some ways. But back to my central question, how do you think about the ongoing pace of technological social change, which we will have to try to manage in the years ahead?
Yeah. In terms of the crisis, it's quite interesting how, we think of the tech platforms as being kind of the ultimate anywhere industry in some ways. It's about, what's the Airbnb slogan, belong anywhere. That sort of, very much the sort of the industries of the sort of cognitive meritocracy, and the people that run them all tend to be very liberal in their politics and so on. They are the symbols of our disconnected, anywhere mobile world. And yet, on the other hand, they're also, and I think we've seen that very much in the crisis, they're also, they have a very benign, positive effect on making local communities more real too. I mean, all the sort of local support groups and WhatsApp groups and so on that have sprung up in the crisis have helped people to connect in a very anywhere-y sort of way, in a very sort of somewhere-y way. But I mean, the other thing is that the tech platforms have been absolutely sort of central, even more central to our lives in the crisis than they were before the crisis. And they've become so much more kind of overtly like public utilities in a way, which I think, I think we're just in the foothills of these businesses, these tech businesses. And I think it's a bit like, regulating the car. I mean, I think back in the 1920s and 1930s, when we had far fewer cars on the road, I think most years about 3,000 or 4,000 people would die. I mean, either in a car or being knocked over by one, and we sort of hadn't worked out literally the rules of the road. Now, we have kind of 100 times more cars on the road, and we have about 1/5 of the deaths on the road every year that we had back then. I mean, and that is because of regulation, essentially, and people kind of learning how to use the technology better as well. And I think both of those things will surely apply to. But you were asking about something slightly different, which is, I suppose, the effect on democracy, which has, I think, been. I don't know. I don't really understand it. I think it's been sort of somewhat paradoxical. On the one hand, obviously, it's given voice to the voiceless, you might say. It's broken open the sort of the gates of the public space. The public space used to be very, very sort of carefully policed by elites. You didn't get to write articles in newspapers or magazines or appear on TV or radio, and unless you sort of pass through quite a sort of narrow gate. And now anybody can say anything and possibly get huge following on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. So it's a sort of it's a democratization in some ways, although it hasn't. I mean, our politics has overwhelmingly become. I mean, pretty well all elements of our. I mean, the people don't really appear in politics any longer. Certainly in Europe. I mean, I don't know how true this is to the US, but I mean, politics is a sort of intra-elite game between a sort of what one might call a sort of insider governing elite and a mass elite, a mass educated elite. I mean, it's an intra-university graduate contest politics. I mean, the people don't really appear except to vote in elections, to be polled in public polls, and to complain about things on social media. But politics is a kind of intra elite, even more than was the case, I think, 40 or 50 years ago, when you did have kind of mass parties. You had ordinary people took part in politics 40 or 50 years ago in a way they only take part now through social media. Political activism has kind of narrowed down to the sort of the kind of graduate mass elite. I mean, that's not necessarily a terrible thing, but it means that the politics often doesn't. Politics is then open to sort of surprises and shocks, like Brexit or like Trump's election, because all of us sort of engaged in the broadest sense. All of us engaged in sort of the political class tend to come from the same kind of backgrounds, which I think was much less the case a while ago.
David, thank you very much. So with the 30 minutes remaining, we're going to open it up to questions. I'm going to call on Ron Dvorkin first. In each instance, would you tell us who you are? And if you could, I respect the conversation, if you could be as succinct as possible so that we get in a good number of our colleagues. And Ron, you're first, please.
Yes, I'm a contributing editor here at the American Interest. My question is, I actually joined this talk because I was interested in the topic of your book coming out in September about praising manual work over intellectual work. I didn't know that you had made the distinction between the somewheres and anywheres. But I'm interested to applying some of my own ideas about technology, sort of echoes what Jeff was talking about, to the problem today. I've noticed that artificial intelligence, I'm concerned, will sort of root out the jobs that involve dealing with the object world, the somewhere world, the world of the everyday space where people live, and leaving intact the what I call the managerial world, which can be done from anywhere, intellectual work. And so I'm wondering if you take the book that you're having come out in September and you have your previous ideas about the distinctions between somewhere and anywhere, will the technology that Jeff mentions, in this case, artificial intelligence, simply accelerate the trend by getting rid of the jobs in the object world, by getting rid of the jobs in the somewhere world, because robots and so on will be able to do that work, leaving only imaginative, creative, symbiotic analyst work?
No, I don't think it will pan out like that. I mean, I think very crudely one can say that automation hits blue-collar jobs and AI hits white-collar jobs. Now, a lot of the automation has already happened. I mean, there is some more that can and will happen, no doubt. But what we're facing in the next wave of technological change, I think, is the realization the knowledge economy doesn't actually need very many knowledge workers, or rather, a lot of the kind of middle and lower level cognitive jobs will disappear. I mean, the kind of I mean, not necessarily the sort of backroom jobs exactly. I mean, but the middle ranking lawyers and accountants and even doctors, through diagnostic technology and all sorts of automated processes that simply mean that we don't need so many lawyers, say. And I think, as I say, I think that means, so yeah, as you say, I've just finished writing this book that's coming out in September called Head, Hand and Heart, which is essentially arguing that, I sort of started off arguing, it was almost like my Road to Somewhere book part 2, in that I was still concerned to try and explain and understand where this sort of, where this discontent with modern societies had come from. And I sort of pulled the camera, so I discussed the value differences in the Road to Somewhere, and I sort of pulled the camera a bit further back and looked at what lay behind the value differences, which I think is essentially the outcomes of the educational meritocracy, the educational stratification. And I overlap to some extent with the Daniel Markovits book in my analysis. Although I think I go further than him and say that actually the problem is, he's still essentially arguing for a better meritocracy. I mean, I'm sort of saying that meritocracy or cognitive meritocracy is itself the problem. Half the population, by definition, will always be in the bottom half the cognitive meritocracy. If you divide society between those who succeed and those who fail, as cognitive meritocracies do, you will end up with mass resentment and mass discontent. And that we have placed, particularly in the last 30 or 40 years, because it has seemed so fair, it has seemed both economically efficient and politically fair to place so much emphasis on cognitive meritocracy. But if you make cognitive ability the gold standard of human esteem, and you draw away prestige from lots of more traditional, manual, even higher manual technical jobs and caring functions and so on, then you end up with a hugely resentful population, which is kind of what we've done, I think. But as I was kind of, I was sort of, when I started writing the book, it was almost rather idealistic, the idea that one could have a sort of better distribution of status between these sort of 3 human aptitude clusters, if you like, head, hand, and heart. I still think, how we get there is still there's still a very big question mark over that. But as I was kind of writing and researching it, this is not a scholarly work. This is a kind of journalistic polemical work. So I was kind of, like I said, I was kind of researching it as I was writing it. But as I was writing it, I realized, I was reading all this stuff on what's happening with technological change. I realized that this, the kind of redistribution has got to happen in a way. It's going to happen partly because, as I say, the knowledge economy doesn't need so many knowledge workers. So, I mean, unless we really do move towards a kind of oligarchic dystopia of the kind that Yuval Noah Harari sometimes talks about, with a kind of tiny group of sort of Zuckerberg-like people at the top, and then sort of everybody else kind of, roaming the streets, sort of, looking for crusts in the dustbins. If we're going to avoid that, then we kind of have to redistribute sort of income and status somewhat to people in non-cognitive functions. And of course, the other thing that supports my argument, the other big trend that supports my argument, is the growing importance of the care economy, both the public care economy and the private one, and the louder voice of women in politics and public affairs more generally. I think we are going to, and this is where, I mean, just sorry, I don't want to go on too long on this, but two final points which link us back to the crisis. I think the two things about the crisis, from the point of view of this head, hand, heart thesis, that will be potentially reinforcing it is, first of all, the fact that we are going to have to, pay and respect care jobs more. Now, it is true, actually, it's a bit of a myth that nurses and doctors are not well paid and respected. Both of them are actually well paid and respected, both in the US and the UK. But there are quite large sections of the care economy that are the sort of Cinderella sections, particularly elderly care, which is it's been a real mess, I think, in both of our countries, and one of the reasons why you had so many deaths in care homes, not just in the US and the UK, actually throughout Europe. It's partly obviously because the disease was older people particularly vulnerable to the disease, but that's been very much the sort of poor cousin of the care economy, and we will have to do something about that. Indeed, even before the crisis, the government here was talking about effectively kind of nationalising the sector and incorporating it into the National Health Service. The other thing, sorry, final point, Jeff. The other thing is that we had here, that it's already faded a bit, but I mean, and you had it in the US too, this appreciation, not just of people who were exposing themselves to the virus in hospitals, not just the heroic nurses and doctors. We also had this story about were the people that sustain the hidden wiring of our societies, the people that stack the shelves in the supermarkets, the people that drive the vans to the pharmaceutical stores and so on. People, the refuse collectors, people doing these really basic jobs. The so-called key workers, and the overwhelming majority of key workers were people without university degrees. They were the hand and heart workers. So I think we saw a sort of shift in status, and I think some of that may linger even after the crisis has passed.
David, thank you, and Ron, thank you. My colleague Danielle, our associate publisher, reminds me and has posted in chat 2 articles by contributors of ours, Steve Lagerfeld, on automation and technology and social change, and of course your work, Ron, and recent work for us, I'm happy to say, on artificial intelligence. If you're in watching or listening by YouTube, that's by Steve Lagerfeld and Ron Dworkin, available on the American Interest website. So, David, thank you. And now I'm looking for a next hand or participant. Who would like to join next? Then I'm going to call on someone. And Demir, I'm going to call on you. Can you hear me right now?
I can hear you. Steve Lagerfeld has his hand up, but I'm happy to ask a question. But Steve, go ahead, please.
I'm coming to you second. So
Yeah.
family, hold back. You work for
absolutely.
TAI, and you and I are colleagues. Steve, you first.
There we are. I'm Steve Lagerfeld. I'm a public policy fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, and was for many years the editor of the Wilson Quarterly. David, you and I crossed paths some years ago. Neither of us really remembers it, but
well, I remember we used to take pieces from the Wilson Quarterly when I was editing Prospect magazine.
Vice versa. Yeah. I was always a a very big admirer of what you did with that. I don't have a really well formulated question here, but I'm interested in this question of the respect and mutual understanding between these different groups that you're talking about. I'm going to just keep it simple, and we'll talk about, you know, the somewheres and the anywheres. And you know, it seems to me you've talked about how the pandemic has reinforced a kind of recognition of the people who are doing the manual labor, the actual work of delivering groceries and taking care of people and so on. And perhaps the effect of this recognition will linger. And let's hope so. I'm struck in my own world, the bubble, the upper middle class bubble. I'm a person who actually came in here from painting my deck before, and I mow my own lawn and I do all this stuff, and all my neighbors think I'm absolutely eccentric, because why would an you know, a upper middle class educated person do such things? I mean, there's nothing good about them. It's what you pay other people who you try not to talk to do.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to kind of get at the core of the problem. You can, you know, turn that into an abstraction, but, you know, and enlarge it. And I have thought fruitlessly for many years about exactly how, what ways are there to deal with that division that's never going to go away. I mean, we're talking about this may get smaller, this group may get smaller, this group may get bigger. So how do we deal with it? National service is an idea that's talked about, and I think that's an interesting idea, but I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I've been very influenced by Matthew Crawford. I love his books. I mean, you know them, I'm sure. He's just got a new one out, actually. I mean, I think it's all about driving. I mean, you know, he often makes this point that actually we will never, I mean, we will always need, as you know, absolutely millions and millions of both basic manual jobs and skilled manual jobs. I mean, it's a sort of illusion of modern economics. I remember, I think it was Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer here in 2006 or 7, I think it was his last or penultimate budget speech. He made this prediction that by, I think about now, I think by 2020 or 2025, there would be 600,000 low-skilled jobs in the UK. And at the time, I don't think anyone really kind of noticed, because I was Labour editor of the Financial Times in the early mid 1990s, and people were producing these kind of reports every day. You know, everyone's going to be a kind of business analyst of some kind, and all the basic jobs are going to go away. It's just complete nonsense. I mean, we probably, depending on how you define a low-skilled job, we probably have between 8 and 10 million of them in the UK. 600,000. I mean, and yet, I mean, you know, and I think it is partly because, you know, the people writing these reports, you know, are kind of judging it on their own experiences in a way. So those jobs, the basic jobs, you know, we're still going to need people to deliver stuff and work in the supermarkets, and but we're also going to need people to mend our cars and mend our computers, and you know, and that can't be done in China or Vietnam. I mean, you know, you want someone to build yourself a deck. Well, I mean, you are heroically doing it yourself. But I mean, you know, most of us probably don't have the carpentry skills to do that. But there are lots of people out there who will, you know, the skilled trades. Yeah, it's true. They have shrunk somewhat, but for partly technological reasons, we probably don't need quite as many electricians and plumbers as we did 50 years ago. But we still need a hell of a lot of them. And if we don't honour them, then no one's going to go into the jobs. I mean, we need to honour them and pay them. And actually, you know, I mean, these things go in sort of cycles, don't they? I mean, if if there's suddenly a shortage of plumbers, then plumbers start getting paid $150,000 a year, and then everyone wants to become a plumber. So there's a bit of sort of market correction, but I think I think the sort of the loss of sort of physical aptitude, sort of, in ordinary families, it is rather a sad thing, and you can sort of see it certainly in the UK anyway. You can sort of see it in TV programs, the kind of nostalgia for when we lived in a much more patch and mend sort of world, and we actually made our own stools and things, and and you got some of those basic skills at school, and then in many cases you sort of continued them throughout your life, and still these impulses, the kind of hand and heart impulses, are still absolutely central to our being, and you see it often when people retire. They often do something that involve, they kind of learn a musical instrument, or they take up carpentry, or they take up something that often has a kind of hand element to it. So I think we're coming out of sort of peak head in some ways. I mean, obviously we still need lots of clever people, to write the software for the robots, and and be brilliant lawyers and financiers and politicians and doctors and so on. But the more, the hand and heart skills will obviously never go away, and I think they're coming round again to be sort of re-honored.
David, thank you, and Steve, thanks for that question and comment. So Damira, thank you for holding back for right now. As we take another guest, I'm going to call on Nicole Penn. Nicole?
Hi, my name is Nicole Penn. I'm the program manager for the American Enterprise Institute's division on social, cultural, and constitutional studies. So thank you for this lovely discussion.
Hey, Nicole, may I interrupt you? Do you ever write or publish yourself?
Oh yes, and I have written a couple articles for the American Interest.
Thank you.
It's terrible to have forgotten. So you've discussed the importance of cultivating respect for head and heart jobs, which is, I think, a very important point. But it seems to varying degrees, and I think there's a lot of people getting ahead of themselves with regards to how quickly the hand professions are going to be replaced by automation. And I think that's something that's important to bear in mind. But it does seem that the heart jobs are, fairly secure in the future, and that it's very difficult to automate those kind of professions. But gender stereotypes seem to be particularly salient in working class communities in a way that prevents men from entering these professions that can generate very good living and are critical. And I wonder, how do we address this interclass respect issue between the hand and the heart professions without being accused of, elite disrespect for working class dispositions, or a kind of cultural imperialism and the imposition of, elite, the liberal gender project? I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
I think it's a really, really good question, and it's something that I do address probably not enough in the book. I was going to say earlier, I don't think I quite finished the thought that while I was writing the book, I kind of realized that things were in some ways moving in a head, hand, heart direction, partly because of the fact the knowledge economy doesn't need very many knowledge workers, but also because of the massive recruitment crises that we have in the care sectors. In both in kind of mainstream nursing and in care for the elderly. One of the reasons why you tend to have very high levels of immigrant employment in these areas, because they're particularly the elderly care is poorly paid, antisocial hours, very emotionally demanding often. And as you say, these so-called pink collar jobs, we haven't seen men, despite the sort of shifts, the greater sort of fluidity in gender identity, you might say, that's emerged in the last 30 or 40 years, kind of masculinity and femininity are not as sort of they don't live as sort of clearly defined, you might say, as they did in our parents' generation. Nonetheless, we've seen, and so one might expect many more men to be ready to step into nursing, for example. And I actually should have looked up for my book and never did in the end, but I'm pretty sure that you have the same issue there as we have here. I mean, 12% of NHS nurses are men, and that's only gone up, I think, 1 percentage point since in the last 20 years. And I think it's even slightly lower in the US. I don't know. You might know yourself. And I think it is a really interesting question. And as you say, the people who, in a sense, given that the kind of highly educated, upper middle classes, who tend to have the more gender fluid, the men tend to, they would have absolutely nothing in principle against being a nurse. It's just that they want to do something more higher status. And the men who might take up the nurse's job because it's not, doesn't require, a PhD, and it's what the kind of thing they might do, they won't do it because it offends against a certain notion of masculinity. I'm just repeating back to you what you said to me. It's not very helpful, I know, but I think I think this is something that we should, apply public policy thought to. I think, some degree of positive discrimination in favor of male nurses. Of course, one of the problems with male nurses, I imagine it's the same in the US as it is in the UK, is that small percentage of them tend to rise to the top very quickly. So that creates a huge amount of resentment from female nurses. I mean, the most senior nurses in most hospitals are often men. It's the opposite of what's the opposite of the sort of glass ceiling. It's the kind of glass escalator. There's a sort of male glass escalator problem. For all the reasons, I guess, that we know. They're less focused on home and children than women are. They're probably more aggressive and disagreeable, and all the things that men are famous for, which is they end up being the sort of chief nursing officer. But I think that's a relatively minor problem. The bigger problem is just getting more men into those pink collar jobs, and I these things though can change very quickly. I think there are kind of reasons to be optimistic. The way that the gender, nursing is not going to suddenly become a sort of dominant male type job for all sorts of sort of almost obvious reasons, but. So actually, this example may be of only little use, but I think it's true to say, or at least I've read this in several places, that that sort of office IT, something that we overwhelmingly now associate with men, used to be very much a female. The kind of the higher secretarial jobs of the 60s and 70s required the women doing those jobs to manage these kind of new kind of electronic typewriters and quite techie stuff involved in operating these things. And then somehow the kind of next stage of IT, the kind of men muscled in, and it ceased to be a kind of female function, became a male one. So actually, when as we start to have more automation in sort of elderly care homes, for example, you've seen that a lot in Japan and places. It could be that actually quite a good male job of the future will be the manager of 10 robots in an elderly care home. It may still be the women who will be doing the more kind of face-to-face sort of emotional interactions in the home, but if you have an army of robots, then it'll probably be men who'll be operating them. It's a really interesting area. Have you written about it? Can I just ask, is it Nicole? Has Nicole written about this?
No, my specialty is in American history.
Oh, okay.
But I have a lot of friends who study the pink collar economics. So
yeah.
I have it on the brain.
Yeah. Well, yeah. If you see any interesting writing on it, do send it to me. I'll get your email from Jeff.
Brilliant. Happy to connect both of you. I'm mindful of time, yours and everybody's, David. David, I have two final questions to wrap us up, and I'll give you both at the same time. The first is, do tell us a little bit about the new book published in September. We want to have you back. We want to have a proper book talk from you at that time. And then two, if I may, in lockdown over there, what are you reading? What are you watching? What are you listening to?
Oh, okay. Well, first one first. Well, I've already sort of talked a bit about it, and I don't kind of want to overdo it because it doesn't come out till September. But I mean, the thesis is in the title, really, and I look at it, and in some ways, as I said, it's a sort of part two of the road to somewhere. It takes forward some of those themes, but it focuses very much on educational stratification and the shift to the knowledge economy and the huge. I mean, this is all very well known stuff. I mean, the much higher returns to education. But what isn't so well known, of course, is that not only down the road is this coming to an end with the fact that the knowledge economy doesn't need that many knowledge workers, but we're already starting to see the kind of the end of the much higher rewards to kind of analytical intelligence type work. I mean, you're seeing that in all sorts of signs. I mean, you've seen the sort of stalling of the expansion of higher education. You've seen, in this country, about a third of graduates are in non-graduate employment. I think it's not that dissimilar in the US, which completely, I think, destroys the kind of, is it the golden and cats? Are any of you economists? I mean, there's this sort of golden cats theory that the reason for inequality is that America stopped producing enough graduates, and therefore the kind of higher cognitive jobs became harder to fill and people got paid more. Well, in that case, how come you got so many bloody graduates who are not in graduate jobs? But anyway, it's all, I mean, it's the kind of return to education is falling away, as it was bound to, as you massified higher education. I mean, you guys were the sort of first out of the traps in that, back in the 40s and 50s with the famous GI Bill and all of that. But it's platted out. It started plateauing out with you about 20, 30 years ago, and it's plateauing out here now. And yeah, I mean, we just have to, for all sorts of reasons, partly because of what we were talking about, the care economy. And the other thing about, I mean, the sort of perhaps the most controversial thing about my new book are all these issues to do with if you're going to raise the status of the public care economy, then do you not also have to raise the status of the private care economy? And how does that coexist with kind of modern gender equality ideas? And because the forms of feminism that we've had both in the US and the UK has been very, very much kind of lean in. It's all about competing equally, making it as easy as possible for women to compete as equals with men in the professional world. And it's been, if not hostile to domesticity, then just kind of not interested in it, really. But I think it's very hard to imagine how one raises the status of care in the public economy without raising the status of care in the private realm too. And that whole and that will be a real challenge, I think, to kind of liberal assumptions about how equality is essentially a kind of labor market story. And anyway, that's I mean, I go into that in some detail. So well, I'm not actually been, I mean, because I've just been finishing a book, I've been sort of doing rather tedious sort of book, I've been flick reading books like the Markovitz book that came out a few months ago on the American meritocracy. You know, so I buy or borrow all these books, and I don't even really read them in an enjoyable way, because you're just sort of gutting them for ideas that you need for your book. So most of my book reading, but what I have discovered, I've been a bit slow on the uptake here, but I've really discovered the world, particularly actually in lockdown and sort of going for jogs and things, and partly actually because at Christmas I got some proper earphones. I mean, most people have had them for 5 or 10 years. I sort of discovered the earphone world, and through the earphone I've discovered the world of podcasts, and I've been really enjoying some both here and the US ones that I've discovered that I think is absolutely brilliant, despite his very annoying sort of robotic voice, is Conversations with Tyler. Absolutely brilliant one he did with John McWhorter. And I have actually been, I mean, I knew about all the black conservatives like McWhorter. I've known about them and indeed read some of them going back quite a few years now. But I mean, Coleman Hughes has a good podcast as well. There's a wonderful, you may have seen a wonderful conversation between McWhorter and Glenn Lowry, which touches partly on all the Floyd stuff. And I did finally sign up to the what's the guy, the kind of famous atheist fellow, Making Sense, Sam Harris, the Sam Harris podcast. I do love all the Harari stuff. Harari is an absolute genius, isn't he? And he's got his own little podcast, although it tends to just kind of, he hasn't really got a podcast. He's got I suppose it is a podcast. He puts up all the things he's done elsewhere. Who else have I come across? Oh, and in terms of watching, I mean, well, of course, I watched. Did you all enjoy Succession? That was great. That was a few months ago now. I've been really enjoying, and actually, Jeff, with your German connections, you would enjoy. Perhaps you have been watching Babylon Berlin.
I have watched a couple episodes. I haven't dug deeply into it, but I know and I've looked at it.
It's absolutely, it's just that they just produced a 3rd series. It's absolutely brilliant. You really get the sort of smell of 1929 Berlin, and it's good for practicing our German. You can turn off the subtitles and then hope you can follow the gist of it. Actually, what I have been doing in the crisis is watching. I've been trying to improve my German by watching. I don't know whether you can get it in the US, but I've been watching the news programs in France and Germany, partly because the news programs here are so depressing. The BBC's gone completely bonkers in the crisis. It's like a sort of second Diana moment. It's kind of sort of emotional, utterly sort of over emotional coverage. I mean, particularly at the height of the crisis, I mean, about half of the main evening news programs was just people kind of weeping. And it was utterly without information or authority. It was kind of infantilizing, so I sort of turned a bit to and also actually it was quite reassuring to discover that Germany's had the best crisis in Europe, and they've managed things. I think partly because of their devolution system, they've managed things quite a lot better than we have. But it was also quite reassuring to discover they were having exactly the same arguments about lack of PPE and lack of ventilators and so on, and French TV as well. I mean, you find that we're all basically having the same arguments and blaming our governments and thinking our governments are uniquely useless. So yeah,
David. So yeah, and that was splendid. What a great hour and so with you. You're a fabulous conversation partner and writer and thinker. We look forward to the new book. We look forward to having you back to discuss the new book in detail. And we'd like to see you in Washington post-lockdown so that we can bring this group together with you over a glass of something. But just great seeing you, and thank you for this.
Well, thank you for producing such a good magazine. Now that I subscribe, I expect it to become even better, please. No, but I'm really enjoying it.
We'll be lifting the bar, I promise you. So to everybody who joined us via YouTube, thank you so much for being with us. Everybody via Zoom, thank you so much. David Goodhart, thank you. We will read with pleasure your new book. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.